Hi, students. I am once again recording this lecture during nap time, so we will see if we make it through or if we get more small children cameos. I don't know. This week we are talking about environmental justice. And so we have one new reading from Schneiderman about this topic. And then we're also going to be applying environmental justice to Octavia E. Butler's excellent dystopia parable of the sower. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the plot or the actual novel structures of Parable of the Sower. For that, please see John Green's excellent analysis of Parable of the Sower that I have linked to this week. And one thing that I like about his lecture that he does is he talks about all the different genres that Parable of the Sower can potentially fit into. He talks about that it can be considered science fiction, it's a dystopia, it's also something called a Bildungsroman, which is really fun for me to read about and study because I studied Bildungsroman in the context of British literature. So young Victorian men growing up and what their story was. So this is quite different than that young Victorian men growing up in the 1800s. But I'm really enjoying thinking about Lauren's story as a Bildungsroman. So I actually really appreciated John Green's thoughts on that because it's a dystopia and because it's climate fiction and because it's science fiction. That's not that the Bildungsroman term is not the one that immediately came to me as a genre, because normally we think about that in terms of Victorian literature, but I absolutely can see that too. And so uh, John Green's lecture talks about just how important and how genre defying in some ways this book is. So I hope you like it. And it goes much more into different parts of the book and what it means and ways to read it and so forth. But for now, let's talk about environmental justice. So we're going to be looking at environmental justice in terms of this book, Parable of the Sower, with thinking about Schneiderman. So Schneiderman talks about that there are serious global environmental problems that have dire consequences for poor people, women, and children, particularly in developing countries. Now, one thing to think about is that we don't necessarily know what's going on in Parable of the Sower exactly, like why there's such extreme income inequality, but it's also somewhat obvious in terms of how income inequality works today, that things have just gradually gotten worse. So if we take Schneiderman's theory about this, that climate change is going to impact those who have the least already even more, we can see how we could get to a dystopia like Parable of the Sower. And then she continues to argue her position. She's talking about a specific project she did in this essay, but then she comes back out and talks about why this is important in general. And so she's talking about that feminists, so this is a feminist reading, and the basic understanding of oppression based on race, class, and gender, you are more inclined to see these issues in the physical environment as well. And so she wants to use the power of science to rectify problems in the physical environment that are also impacting these populations the most. And so I've included just one quote from Butler to think about this, and it does have some salty language, so I will warn you about that. And she's actually talking about the death of her brother Keith at this point in the story. So that's narratively what's happening. And she's describing how she feels about it. And she says he never cared what he did. If he wanted to something and wouldn't cause him harm, immediate physical harm, I should read that correctly because that's an important point. Immediate physical harm, he did it, fuck the earth. And so she's talking about Keith, who she calls sociopathic, but also stands in for a metaphor for this idea that if it doesn't cause someone immediate physical harm, or yourself immediate physical harm, people will often do it. And we see this with environmental problems. They're oftentimes removed from us. So if we pump our our toxic sludge to the rip downstream, we don't have to see it anymore, but we don't think about how that impacts the people who are downstream. And ironically, that term downstream is now used to talk about people who have less downstream problems, because literally we pump toxins downstream. And also putting our garbage somewhere else, or having some neighborhoods that have a lot of resources and affluence, and some neighborhoods that have been historically disadvantaged because there have never been incentives to build there. Haven't been loan programs where you could build there. So they have been decentivized throughout history. And so we're seeing this. And oftentimes it's more complicated because it's not something we can literally see. So it's easy to call something racist or sexist if it happens right in front of us and it's interpersonal. We can see it happening. It's causing someone physical pain. But what about these more abstract problems that happen that are also racist and sexist and classist, but they impact people in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, because we don't have the forethought to think about the problems that they might cause. Now, Butler does, right? She writes this dystopia absolutely thinking about what are our actions now doing to the future. So that's something to think about with environmental justice.